Hi, this is Travis here at Exercise Lab with another video for you guys. So I'm a doctor of physical therapy for those of you who don't know me, and I want to talk to you guys about longevity today, specifically from a strength training perspective. So longevity can be spoken about from all kinds of different lenses. We could talk about the supplementation, we could talk about building up an aerobic base, we could talk about just kind of health and wellness, healthy living type things. I want to be talking about how to get strong and essentially stay strong over the decades. So not just about how to get strong for the next year or two, because clearly there's a lot of guys who've done that and it didn't work out very well, whatever strategy they used. Well, how do you get strong? How do you stay strong? How do you fend off some of that age-related decline in function that tends to happen over the lifespan? Not to say we can completely eliminate it, but maybe we can reduce it and kind of get the most, years out of our life, so to speak. So if you're interested in learning a little more about how to do that, go ahead and stay tuned and we'll get started. All right, and so before I get into sort of the demonstration aspect and kind of give you all the different nuances of what I'm going to talk about in this video, I want to just kind of hit you with the big categories, sort of the broad bins as they call them. What are the real pillars of strength you want to build up? And so, again, walking into a weight room, and it doesn't necessarily even have to be a weight room, but wherever you're going to end up doing this, you have to think about, well, where do I start? What do I want to do? And so the big categories, and again, I'm not the first person to bring these to light. Other people have definitely talked about them. Pushing and pulling are going to be two of the big categories. You got to push something, you got to be able to pull something towards you. And we can talk about how to do that at different angles and why you might want to do that or maybe not do that, depending on what some issues you could have are. We're going to be talking about squats and deadlifts, which, squatting effectively is just being able to stand up from a low surface, potentially, or even just a regular surface, being able to just stand up, being able to sit back down under control and do that well. Being able to essentially pick something up off the ground is effectively a deadlift. So, when we say deadlifting, you can think about, lifting a heavy barbell off the ground, but you could also just think about picking up a bag of mulch, perhaps, if, maybe you're in your eighth decade of life and that's something you want to do. And then the other thing we're going to be talking about is carrying. So not just being able to pick that thing up off the ground, being able to transport it somewhere. So obviously, people then, as they approach their, seventh and, eighth, ninth decades of life, sometimes just carrying a sack of groceries from one room to the other can be a daunting task. And so how do we stay strong for those types of things? I'll be talking to you guys about how to do that in this video today. I could have probably put a sixth category in there, which would be sort of that power, plyometric, almost agility type category, because, the ability to move, at high velocity rapidly is going to be an important thing as well. But I realize that's kind of its own category, so I'm not going to really get into that in this video today. This is going to be more kind of that more deliberate strength, generating maximum force. The cool thing is building up maximum force does actually seem to carry over to power to a large degree. So the one cool thing is, if you were to just build up your squat, there's a good chance you're also going to build up your power to an effect as well. So you get a little bit of a free pass on that one, not entirely, but sort of. So all that being said, let's go ahead and get to the demonstrations, and here we go. In the last video, I actually talked about a dumbbell press more because I was thinking about having that freedom kind of, rather than having what we call a closed chain position as you would in a push-up. Having more of that open chain, I felt like might be a little bit better on the shoulders. But because there's so many other muscle groups you're able to tap into, and I would say from a bang for your buck perspective, you definitely get more core, you even get some hip and thigh because you're trying to hold your body in a straight line. I think push-ups actually probably a superior exercise to doing a dumbbell press. The only complicated thing really with push-ups is that after a while, the loading of it just gets a little bit tricky because it gets too easy for certain people. So, obviously many people are not at a level where they're able to do push-ups on the ground, or at least to do enough of them to warrant, increased loading. But if you are at a point where you can spit out, 20, 30 push-ups and you really don't feel like you're that tired at the end, it certainly would make sense to try to see how can I increase my load. And the simplest way to do that would be to probably add a weighted vest. There are ways to add bands as well, and I've spoken to that in some other videos, so you can definitely check out some of my earlier content. In the beginning of this channel, I uploaded a chest video, and I talked about how to add bands to push-ups, so certainly check that out. I actually, more often than not, sometimes I still add in bands in my push-ups, but I end up using weighted vests. The main thing with weighted vests, as I'll show you, is it does add some thickness to your chest wall effectively, and so you're going to touch the ground a little earlier. So I'll be talking about how to still keep that range of motion. But let me show you guys what I mean by a push-up here. Now, certainly you could get some of those like perfect push-up type things if you wanted to. I tend to like to just use dumbbells. The main reason I do this is because it keeps the wrist a little more neutral. When you're just on the ground, you're putting your wrist in a fair amount of extension. And, it's never a bad idea to try to maintain range of motion. If you're just at a point where you're at body weight, I think that's probably fine. I don't think that that's like undue stress. Obviously, if that caused pain or discomfort or something, then, you can go to a modification like this. I think it becomes more important probably as you're increasing load. So if you really have a lot of load and you're in a very, sort of extended wrist position like that, you might just be putting a little more stress on that area than you need to be. So I tend to use these a lot when I'm using a weighted vest. All right, so here's my weighted vest. So as you can see, I have a little more depth here. And so as a result of that, one of the cool things about putting my hands on these dumbbells is it helps to keep me a little more elevated off the ground so that when I come in here now, I can still get effectively a full range of motion. And so I can still come in here and I can do my push-ups, you know, the same way as I would if I didn't have this weighted vest on as far as the range of motion at my shoulder is concerned. And so I would like adding dumbbells for that. You might notice I have these angled a little bit too. I primarily do that just because normally when I'm doing a push-up type motion, rather than being straight ahead or too wide, I tend to be in a little tighter, and I tend to also turn my hands just a little bit. I tell people, imagine you're driving kind of a school bus. You have sort of that 10 and 2. Now I think it's supposed to be 9 and 3, but you know, back in the day it was 10 and 2. 10 and 2 on a big wheel. That's kind of the position I like to spend most of my time with pressing. Now, the thing with longevity, I will say, is that you're going to probably want to vary the angles a little bit. You might have one position you're going to try to build up the majority of your strength. Once you can maintain that, though, it can be nice to actually play around with your hand spacing just to kind of give that shoulder joint a little novelty, a little variety, because really what you're trying to do is spare the length of the life of that joint as long as possible. And if you're always coming back to that same position, so a power lifter, for instance, you know, strength is very specific. So if I'm a power lifter, I'm going to want to always have kind of a very similar setup, almost, you know, to the degree that like some people who shoot free throws do. They have a very procedural way that they do it because they're trying to tap into a very specific motor pattern that's almost rote. And that's going to be great for maximum force production. That being said, that's going to lend itself a little bit more to repetitive stress because you're always coming back to that exact same groove, that exact same angle, versus if I'm just trying to spare my joints and get the most out of them, I don't really care about absolute maximum force. I want to get strong, but I don't need to get that strong. And so as a result of that, I think sometimes varying up the angle can be a nice way to go. You know, certainly you can get those, you know, perfect push-up type things if you wanted to. I really don't use those. I tend to just use dumbbells, and I just kind of play around with the spacing. That being said, you don't want to go to absurdly, you know, wide widths, you know, where you're putting the joint at a severe disadvantage, you know, mechanically, because that will increase stress. So I tend to, you know, majority of the time, you know, I never really go to a full flare typically, but I'll go a little shy of it. And I never go to that pure like yoga style butted up here, but I'll kind of come in here a little bit. One of the problems with those yoga style push-ups I see a lot is when you're really butted up down here, is it tends to throw the shoulder forward quite a bit. So people that come in here, you know, you got to just watch to make sure you're not letting that happen. And so as I push away, I'm trying to effectively spread my shoulder blades and then come down for a little tap, and then up I go, as I just showed kind of a moment ago. But again, cool thing with weighted vests, you know, you can get pretty heavy on these. I have different weighted vests. You know, you can certainly get multiple ones if you wanted to. At a certain point, though, even with the vest, it does get a little cumbersome because you can only add so much weight to a vest. You know, you have to start stacking these on top of each other, and then it does get kind of weird. So sometimes adding in bands or chains can be another layer to the cake with this. So if you're looking to get, you know, really strong, you're at a point where even the vest you have is not quite doing it for you, throwing some bands or chains on here can be a cool way to go as well. But in a nutshell, that's the push-up or the press. All right, so the next exercise category is going to be a pull. And so I did talk about this in another video, and I uploaded this video again primarily because the audio quality was bad, but I also did rethink a few things as well. But this was an exercise that was in the last video, and I think dumbbell presses essentially are great exercises. So push-ups, my number one in this video. Dumbbell rows are going to stay my number one. The close second, though, would be probably a TRX style row. And if you don't know what that is, I did upload another video on the TRX a few videos back, so you can certainly check that out. The TRX row is great because it's just a nice way to incorporate your body weight. So it does pull in, I would say, in some ways, more musculature. But again, you do run into problems with loading parameters. You know, you certainly can add weighted vests to TRX, and I think that's a great way to do it. And I certainly do that from time to time as well. But I just like doing the dumbbell rows also. It's a little more plug and play. Not everybody has TRXs, and I'm not trying to stack you guys up with like buying more and more stuff per se unless you want to. And the way I like to typically set this up, one nuance and one thing I like to do, this was something I learned, I can't even remember from who, but I was watching a long time ago an old bodybuilding video, and rather than pulling this, into my kind of abdomen here, what I like to do is pull it back a little bit more, almost towards my pocket. And I found once I added that technique in, it really does a nice job incorporating the lats. Whereas when you come in here, you also tend to want to shrug your shoulder a lot of times. And so you see people doing dumbbell rows and they're kind of in here. So notice how I put the head of this up a little bit. That's just for stabilization. You know, you probably don't want to be real tight in here if you're using a heavy dumbbell because it's just going to be kind of awkward and you're unstable. So I go a little wider, kind of almost a kickstand as I call it in this leg. You still get a nice job doing your, recruiting your core musculature. And then from there, basically, you grab your dumbbell and I pull it back. Okay, something like that. And notice how on that, there's maybe a little rotation at the bottom, mainly because I'm trying to stretch my lat and then pull it back just to get kind of a nice, good range of motion there. You don't necessarily want to really twist on this though, because, twisting, particularly with a heavier load, is going to be problematic for your back. One of the reasons I think this works so nicely is because with this stabilization hand, and by the way, you don't necessarily have to have that up. I just like to do that because I think it's a little easier on the wrist, and I just feel like I can get more purchase on the bench this way than having it flat. If you're on a bench that doesn't have this though, I mean, certainly you could still do it without it. Now, I do sometimes do this standing up as well, which I'll show you guys in a moment. But one thing I wanted to mention is that the reason why I think this works so nicely is because with this stabilization arm, I'm effectively pushing statically into this bench as I'm pulling with this arm. So it's almost like this is happening, even though nothing is happening here. But by pushing into that arm and pulling here, my back is much more stabilized. Now, if I was doing something like a bent over barbell row, that's just a lot of isometric back extension. And so after a while, particularly with a heavy barbell row, that's just going to be really hard to do. And what ends up happening is you're either going to have to kind of flail it, you're going to probably use body English, or you're just going to end up putting undue stress on your back for no reason. And so I don't think you're going to be able to do heavy barbell rowing for, the 7th, 8th, 9th decade of life. I just don't think you're going to have the back for it if you've been doing it for such a long time, particularly with heavy loads. And so I think longevity-wise, you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck here. Still do an excellent job recruiting the lats. I would say you pretty much can probably even do a better job recruiting your lats. Because you're more stabilized, you're not so much limited by what your low back can tolerate. And so for that reason, I think doing a dumbbell row single arm style like this is a superior exercise. And if you want to incorporate a little more hips and trunk, you can do it standing, which I'll show you guys now. All right, so if you want to pull a little more core and hips into the dumbbell row, you can just plant just the hand and stand. So this knee, rather than being supported on the bench like it was a moment ago, is just in standing, okay? Aside from that, it's pretty much identical. And so I would come in here, I would still pull this thing in, towards that back pocket area, a little stretch at the bottom, and then bam, I just kind of pull it right back, trying to get as much of a full range as I can, something like that. And so that's a nice way that you're still pretty stabilized. Obviously, because my leg is less supported, I have to do a little bit more work on that standing leg. So it's just kind of a cool way to make it a little more full body. So I would say you can always mix and match. You're going to probably be a little stronger, maybe, when you're on the bench versus standing for that reason. So if you're really looking to load up the lats a little heavier, I would say maybe try and do the first version. If you're looking to get kind of more of that full body effect, maybe do the second one. And again, just try to mix and match maybe from time to time. One thing that can be tempting when you're doing the standing version is not necessarily to cheat, but to use a little bit more momentum. And so when you're doing this one, sometimes you're almost kind of like popping the hip and kind of jumping as you pull into that row. And so again, if you're pretty mindful of your technique, you've got good form overall, and you're really trying to inch out a few extra reps at the end, sometimes I think using a little momentum and body English, as we call it, can be warranted. So, I would start out fairly strict, and then maybe at the end, just kind of use just a little pop, within reason, to kind of give myself that, last couple of reps, maybe, if I'm trying to really take that set to failure. So a little bit of an advanced technique, but that's there for you. All right, so even though I know I said squats is our third category, I'm actually not going to really show squats in this video. I did a transformer bar video where I did talk about squats and how to, squat technique and that type of thing. The reason why I'm not going to talk about squats per se in this video is really only because I think that if you're young and you're fit and you're really able-bodied, squats are great. I think that if you're starting to get into that 6th, 7th, certainly 8th and 9th decade, squatting, particularly barbell squatting, can be a little bit problematic. And so what ends up morphing into is more kind of what we call like a sit to stand. Now, there are definitely ways to load that. And I would say that if you're at a point right now where just sitting and standing is difficult, then sit to stands are certainly the exercise you want to do. And again, nothing too fancy. If you need to balance yourself a little bit, you could just kind of come down for a little touch and go style. This is a 16-inch box. We talk a lot about parallel, and what that means is effectively that the knee is going to be just a little higher than the hip. The reason why that's important is because that's kind of where our hip runs out of range of motion. And once we, that knee gets flexed too high, it ends up rounding our low back. And so, we call that sometimes kind of like a butt wink when you see somebody's hips kind of roll under on a squat. And that's going to be a recipe for somebody who's probably going to have some difficulty with their back. And so really you want to only squat as low as what your hips can move into to keep that neutral spine, because keeping that spine neutral is going to be really helpful for longevity. Now, if you're at a point though where just sitting and standing is really easy, you have to start to think, well, how do I load that up? The most obvious way is to use barbells. And, I certainly, again, do that all the time. I think it's a great exercise. But what I'm really kind of thinking now with barbell squats is I want to maintain it more than I want to really bring it up a lot. So fortunately, I'm at a level where I feel like I've got my squats in a pretty good place. If you're at a point though where your squats aren't that good, if you can't at least barbell squat probably like your body weight, I think would be at least a kind of bare minimum. If you're in that kind of 5th, 6th decade, I think, being able to squat body weight-ish would still be a pretty, good goal, because it's going to help you weather those later decades where it's going to become increasingly difficult. If you're at a point, though, where you can pretty comfortably squat body weight, then I would say you're probably better up loading yourself in other ways, a little more creative ways, such as maybe split squats or even step-ups. And so I'm going to talk about step-ups here. I think step-ups are a great exercise because not only do they strengthen you, but they can also kind of tax you a little bit more aerobically as well. And I think the loading is probably just a little bit safer on the spine. Now, that being said, if you have SI joint issues, being in a split squat or a staggered stance may not be as good. So again, one size fits all is not always going to work. But that being said, generally speaking here, I think you're going to get a little bit more bang for your buck, over the long run by spending your time on step-ups. I like to bring my leg up just for a little touch. And so what I'll do is I'll just kind of come up, light little touch, come down, and I always switch my feet at the bottom, okay? And I'm trying to drive my midfoot to heel region. I'm not way back on the heel like some people will tell you. I'm kind of getting myself fairly even distributed here. I'm also obviously not on the balls of the feet either, because that's just going to put an undue stress on the knee. So, you want to get a good amount of your foot on the box, almost the whole thing if you can. Sometimes my heel doesn't make it all the way on, but that's okay. And so, depending on how strong you are, you could come in here just for a warm-up. And so again, I'm not really pausing very long at the top or the bottom, almost more like a bodybuilder style in a sense, but no reason why you couldn't do a little more of a pause if you wanted to. Sometimes you'll bring up that other leg just to get a little more hip flexion in there and kind of spend a little more time on that stance leg. I don't really think that's going to be a big deal breaker either way. If you're somebody who needs a little more work on balance, that might be an okay way to do it. But most of the time, again, if I'm working more strength, just a little tap is all I need. And then I'm back down and I switch, okay? Once you're at a point where you can do, 15, 20 of those without too much difficulty, I think increasing load is kind of a logical next step as far as making this a more effective exercise. And so, again, if you have that weighted vest, certainly you could throw that on. Dumbbells, I think, are just kind of an easy go-to. So, pick up a pair of dumbbells, and then you're going to, effectively do the same thing. So, I'm going to drive that foot through, little touch, come down, little touch. And, again, I would just go until I feel, a bit of fatigue. What's nice about this as well is that it helps you to kind of iron out some strength imbalances. So you might notice that, oh, hey, when I'm doing this on my left leg, it doesn't have quite as much gusto as the right. So that would obviously indicate, okay, spend a little more time on that left side. Maybe do an extra set on the left side. Start with the left side first, something like that, and try to bring that up to where it's somewhat equal. Imbalances can hide a little bit more in a squat. And so if you don't have a trainer or somebody who can kind of watch you, tell you what you're doing, squats a little more technique intensive. If they're not necessarily very in tune with their body, they don't know how to hip hinge very well, they're going to be thinking about it a lot, kind of processing what's happening with their body as they're doing that squat. And as a result, it's going to be harder for them to get a training effect. It's going to be harder for them to get that, increased demand on the legs, increased demand on the cardiovascular system, versus something like a step up. It's a little more plug and play. It's not very technique intensive. And so for that reason, I think also, those people that are getting into those, higher decades of life, sometimes step ups can be nice. Also helps them work on their balance a little bit more, I would say, which can be a helpful thing for those people as well. Obviously, you may not want to use such a high box initially with somebody who's older. You got to cut that box according to somebody's size and, make sure it's a challenge for them, but you're also keeping them within that target rep range you're looking for to kind of drive those adaptations. All right, so next category, I'm going to talk about deadlift. I'm going to kind of lump that in with carrying. So, deadlifts, and I've spoken to deadlifts in the past and how to do it. The main thing is you really want to get a good hip hinge, and that's really what's key about doing a deadlift well, is being able to effectively move a bar in a straight line. So you want to keep it right against you, and people who deadlift well, that bar is going to just drop straight down as their spine stays neutral. Now, people who don't do that very well, they're going to let the bar drift way out forward, which is again going to increase that distance to the low back. So it's going to put a penalty on their low back. And for that reason, I don't like stiff leg deadlifts. I don't recommend people do them. An RDL, though, is basically where you start out with a barbell from the top, go down, for a light tap if you want on the ground, like you would with a standard deadlift, and then you're back to the top position again. Now, somebody who's, maybe a bit older or just kind of wants to simulate real life a little bit more could certainly get a heavy medicine ball. It challenges your grip in a little bit of a different way. You still take your deadlift stance, you can kind of bend down and you could pick that up, and you could still do sort of a touch and go style, or you could just do kind of a lift and hold. But that could be a cool way to simulate somebody who maybe has to pick up bags of mulch, or maybe if you want to pick up a grandchild, something like that. So, you can get these things pretty heavy these days. I think they go up to even 150 pounds. So I think this can be a cool way to just kind of do an alternate form of deadlifting. RDLs, though, I think are still a great exercise. So I do that exercise quite regularly, where I'm taking a barbell, and I do have a deadlift also with a band video. One of the cool things about doing this with a band is you get more tension at the top versus the tension starts to lighten as I go here and then more at the top again. So it's a way that you can do this in sort of a more back-friendly way if you want to think about it like that. So sometimes somebody who's maybe a bit older, maybe doesn't have a great back to begin with, rather than loading up a heavy barbell, I can have them do it with some bands, and that actually works out pretty well for them. So that's another strategy you can always keep in your back pocket. But deadlifts in general, I think, are just very foundational. And again, what it really speaks to is this whole hip hinging thing. So once again, it's like you had a rotisserie just going through your hip, and this is how you want to move. Now, many people will tend to move higher up, so they might move through their lumbar spine, they might move through their middle back, and so they're going to be doing this. So the other guy who's not doing the deadlift very well is not just the guy who lets the bar drift out in front, but the guy who kind of rounds his back as he goes down, okay? And so if you're going to be rounding your back as you go down, you're going to be putting a lot more stress on those discs, because those discs tend to move more posteriorly or towards the back. When we flex our spine, what you want to be able to do is, have a nice preserved, midsection. You're going to try to keep that neutral spine perhaps a little bit braced, up and down you go. And so if you can deadlift well by hip hinging well, that's pretty back sparing, I would say, in a lot of ways, because anytime you're going to pick something up, that's basically the way you want to do it. And so rather than picking up things, all kinds of different ways, and, one of the worst ways to pick something up is when you're doing a combination of bending and twisting. So say if I want to grab this thing, I'm bending and I'm twisting simultaneously to retrieve this off the ground. That's going to put a tremendous amount of stress, on my low back and, my back in general for that matter. And so what you want to always do when you're going to pick something up is effectively get over it, use your legs. And they used to always tell people that not use their back at all. And so you would do this kind of awkward stoop where you keep your back, very upright, and it's almost where you're going to be kind of on the balls of your feet. And then you would, pick it up like that. It's kind of an awkward way to pick something up. I don't typically recommend people do that. I would say learn to hip hinge well, and then you effectively want to do almost more like a deadlift style. Now, depending on the size of the object, you may want to squat a little more or less. And so with a squat, you'll notice how when I'm squatting down on something, I squat and my knee ends up being, a little bit above my hip, versus when I'm deadlifting something, my bottom position is my hips are quite a bit above my knees. And so for that reason, it ends up incorporating a lot more of my hip extensor and, kind of low back extensor muscles. And so depending on the size of the object, I might want to opt for a little bit more of a squat versus a deadlift, depending on what I'm picking up. But I would say that the key takeaway is just making sure that regardless of which way you're doing it, that you're doing it in a way where you're hinging through your hips and keeping your neutral spine. And so whether you're picking up a heavy medicine ball, a bag of mulch, picking up a barbell, you want to really make sure you get that hip hinging down. I think the barbell can be an effective tool to teach that, because if you're keeping that bar right against your shins, there's a good chance you're going to be hinging from your hips pretty well. But again, when in doubt, it doesn't hurt to have a second pair of eyes on you. All right, so I'm not necessarily going to gloss over this, but I think carrying, is a little more self-explanatory. The main things I'll say is if you're going to carry things, the more straightforward way to do it is to do more like a farmer's carry or a farmer's walk. Sometimes you're going to be carrying an object, though, that doesn't have, such a nice handle to grip on. And so carrying something like, maybe a grandchild, for instance, or again, that bag of mulch, having a heavier medicine ball. You could carry it up high if you wanted to kind of simulate that grandchild. Carrying it here, if you really wanted to cheat a little bit, you could kind of hold it, down here, or you're not having to work your hands. I would say try to challenge your grip a little bit, though. Maybe hold it like this and then see if you can walk that way. That's going to actually get some isometric biceps. One way I didn't mention in the deadlift section, though, if you want to learn to pick something up and hip hinge, you could start from a little higher, right? So if I had a bad back or somebody who just has a hard time hip hinging, I could just sometimes break that movement down into a component by starting them on something higher. then eventually work them down to the floor. So that can be a strategy you can also keep in your back pocket. But whether you're carrying a heavy medicine ball, whether you're carrying something like some heavier dumbbells, and again, you could determine the distance, or, sometimes I like to do it for time. I might use a parameter like, let's go ahead and just go for 30 seconds or 60 seconds, right? So time under tension on a typical set, a traditional exercise is going to be like 40-ish, maybe 45 seconds. So, I think that's probably not a bad parameter to start with. And then if you want more of that muscular endurance aspect, then certainly you could try to go a little bit longer. Grip strength has certainly come under more attention recently because it's a nice, kind of marker of longevity, right? People who have strong hands seem to live longer, or at least thrive more in the later years of their life. And, again, the reasoning for that, it's been pretty well described. And it's basically because it's not that having strong hands per se is what helps you live longer. But if you have strong hands, it's a good chance that you have a stronger body overall. And that body that you have that's stronger probably took something to build it up to get it there, right? You probably weren't just born super strong and stayed that way. You're probably exercising on a fairly regular basis. So having strong hands kind of just tells me a little bit about all those things. It tells me, well, this is probably an individual who's, pretty strong in general. And if they're pretty strong in general, they're probably doing some exercise, some activities that keep them that way. And so that's how I know that person is going to be more robust, not purely because their hands are strong. That being said, I don't think it's a bad idea to work on grip strength, and I think it can definitely be a very useful thing to do. So I think, using some of these strategies can be helpful. Doing things like dead hangs can be a great way to build up your grip strength. And as you'll see here, sometimes you can put some fatter grips. And I talked about this in another video. I did a York grip video, which is a cool product by AbMat that can really strengthen your hands in more of a pinch grip style. So there's different cool ways you can strengthen your hands. Feel free to check out some other content in the channel. And so I think carrying is just, ends up being one of those very foundational things to do. And anytime you can kind of kill a few birds with one stone. So if you can do your carrying and your grip strengthening at the same time by doing something like a farmer's walk, I think that's a great way to go. So I always try to see if I can combine multiple things to kind of get the best of both worlds. And so I think a farmer's walk, or a farmer's carry as they call them, can do that pretty well for you. Certainly there's also rucking, right? So you can put a heavy backpack on. Rucking, though, I think sometimes can be a little problematic with the backs. So I'd say it's not necessarily going to be your best bet longevity-wise. Per se. If you do rucking maybe somewhat sparingly and you're not using super heavy loads, I think it can probably be okay. But I think if you're doing, really, long rucks with heavy loads, it's probably going to end up fatiguing the back, end up putting a little bit more stress on your spine than you want, especially on hikes where you're, stepping in kind of, rotating ways and things of that nature. And my guess is people who ruck with really heavy loads are not necessarily going to have spectacular backs in the later decades of their life. I think this is always a balancing act, what's meaningful to you versus what's going to help you live the longest, and try to see, how you can make those two things fit together. Obviously, you don't want to do things that are going to make you pay really high penalties later in life, but at the same time, you don't want to necessarily do the things that are going to make it so that your life's not that enjoyable, and so then you're 90, but you didn't necessarily take advantage of some of the things you wanted to do. So all that being said, that's the video for today. I want to give you guys some more content on longevity in another video as well. So this isn't like the end-all be-all here. There's probably going to be a part 2, 3 maybe going forward. But, this is basically how I would approach strengthening, from a longevity perspective. And one of the things I didn't necessarily talk a lot about in the other video, which I've taken down now because this video is going to sort of, supplant that. But basically is that, your workout will tend to evolve over the course of, your training career. What I like to tell people to do, now at this point in time is you want to build up a certain foundation of strength, and then you're going to want to try to maintain it. And so, because at a certain point, I don't think more is always going to be better, right? So if you're at a point where you're doing 100-pound, dumbbell chest presses, do you need to still continue to try to go 105, 110, 120? I think at a certain point, there's sort of diminishing return, right? So you're going to have to become increasingly specialized to try to, keep, increasing that strength. And as a result of that, I think your joints are going to start to pay a penalty. So there's kind of a sweet spot where, being weak is going to be a problem. Being super strong because of what you're going to have to do and endure effectively to get yourself there is also going to potentially be a problem. So I think it's one of those things where there's a sweet spot that's in the middle where you want to be strong and you also want to be strong for the long haul. And so, again, the power lifter, he's got to do what he's got to do because, his job is to lift the maximum amount of weight. But if you're not a power lifter, I would say, well, why expose your body to those penalties? On the other hand, if you're a couch potato, well, he doesn't have to do what he has to do. He needs to start doing something. But if he's not doing anything, well, there's going to be penalties to be paid there as well. And perhaps he won't have a lot of orthopedic issues, but he certainly is going to probably have some medical ones. And so if you look at, again, those far ends of the spectrum, those are the people that I think usually end up being, kind of the problem children, so to speak. So you always want to try to find the middle. So the question then becomes, well, how strong do I need to be strong enough? And I think that's the question that's kind of open to debate. Research will probably and hopefully continue to clarify that for us. But what I would say for now is that, there's sort of some minimum standards people have thrown out there, be able to bench press your body weight, be able to squat 1.5 times your body weight, things of that nature. So, I would say for the average individual who, is just looking to kind of, again, be somewhat fit and healthy. I mean, there's certainly been people who've lived well in their 90s and they've done well and they never even stepped into a weight room. So it's not to say that it's really essential that you build up, that squat to 1.5 or 2 times body weight, But I think if you do that, there's a better chance that you can weather some of the storms that maybe prevented other people from getting to those stages of the game, or at least getting to that stage of the game in a way where they're still somewhat physically robust. Because there's also plenty of people who didn't get to that ninth decade and doing very well physically, right? And so some people get there and they're really not doing very well at all. They're not very mobile because they didn't have much strength to lose, and then that last flu they got really did them in, and now their strength is just very minimal. And so the thing is, the more robust you are, the more you have to work with. And one thing I like to always tell patients is, if somebody's pretty strong and that guy has a medical condition that takes him down 30%, well, now he's here, right? But if that guy was starting there and he lost, say, 30%, well, now he's here, right? And so that guy's going to be in a much tougher spot than the first guy. And so that's one of the best arguments for exercise, I think, is it just gives you a lot more to work with. And, almost regardless of what storm comes your way, I think it just gives you a little bit more to weather it. And so, whether you're talking about somebody who has heart disease or somebody who had cancer or somebody who has diabetes, any of those things can be a huge problem, obviously. But that being said, if you're more physically strong, it just gives you a little bit more to work with. And the other argument is, well, if you're really physically strong, why do you have those problems? And I know that's another conversation I won't necessarily get into in this video. Strength does decline as we get older, unfortunately. And so our best weapon against that does seem to be resistance training. Once you've gotten to a point where you've kind of hit those bare bones parameters, right? So all those things are easier. You can start to increase the load to a certain point. And then at a certain level, you can just back it off into what I call maintenance mode, right? So as I kind of alluded to earlier, I've got my squat to a place where it's pretty good now. I'm not necessarily trying to get stronger at squatting, but I want to make sure that I'm still maintaining a certain level on the squat. And so I've found that if I do a squat, say once every 2 weeks, it allows me to maintain my strength pretty well. And I've actually been able to increase it a little bit, just doing once every 2 weeks, which is not very often. And so what the great thing is, I can still squat, so I know I'm proficient at it, and so I've still kept that level of strength. But then during the week, I can also do some different exercises just to give my body some variety and some novel stress. And so, because there's that whole idea of muscle confusion. If you're doing different exercises all the time, you're not necessarily building up your strength because there's no constant variable you have to kind of track your progress. And so I think it is important to have, kind of like in today's video, those sort of foundational pillars of strength, and that can kind of be the backbone of your progress. And then around that, you can work in a lot of other exercises just to kind of give your body some variety, some novelty. So, throw in those TRX rows and maybe, sometimes, throw in that landmine press or whatever else it is, as long as, obviously you can do these things without pain. But, if you want to do those exercises just to give yourself some novelty, and come back to those pillars and just as a check-in, say, hey, can I still bench press that 1 or 1.5 times body weight or wherever you want to take it, and just make sure you can maintain it. And then the cool thing is you don't have to do it as frequently, which will be joint sparing, and you can kind of focus your efforts on other things. And so I think that's kind of the way to do this for the long haul. That's at least my thoughts for now. I might come back to this and revisit that later. And so that's how I basically started to train myself, and it seems to be working out okay for the moment. But I'll let you guys know how that goes. And so definitely comment below. Let me know what you guys think. Subscribe if you like this stuff. Hope you learned something today. And as always, I hope you have some fun.